If you've been following what's been going on in Seattle, this may not be surprising news, though I will say it seems to be very surprising for people who still live in Seattle. I have many friends who live there still. I was a TV news reporter there for many years. I worked for the NBC affiliate. And so, this news that Chief Carmen is retiring from the Seattle Police Department is kind of big news out in the Pacific Northwest, especially because of everything that led up to it. You'll probably remember the CHAZ chop, that autonomous zone, and there was sort of intimations, there was kind of drama behind the scenes about that Chief Best did not want to abandon the East Precinct, which essentially allowed for the CHAZ to take hold there, but that there was some conflict, I guess, with the mayor, Jenny Durkin, that she didn't want the police to, fight back against the protesters, and not totally sure what was going on there, but there seemed to be a little bit of tension going on behind the scenes, and then boom, this situation happens with Carmen Best deciding that she's going to retire. So this article from the Seattle Times actually attributes this, well, it doesn't say it's directly a causation, but it essentially says in the first graph that there has been criticism over the police department's response to the protests over police brutality, and that there have been votes by the city council to shrink the police force and cut her wages. If you go to her letter, they link here, it says that she wanted them to hear this news from her directly, but that there some media beat her to the punch essentially and got the word out there. She says, quote, "This was a difficult decision for me, but when it's time, it's time." She thanks the mayor for support. She says, "I am confident the department will make it through these difficult times. You truly are the best police department in the country, and please trust me when I say the vast majority of people in Seattle support you and appreciate you." She then says she's looking forward to seeing how the department essentially transforms itself, and she says moves forward through the process of, quote, re-envisioning public safety, and that she says, "We've had tough times before and come out better on the other side. I am glad I pushed through each of these tough times with you. I am grateful for the opportunity to have served as your chief. Remember to take care of one another." Now, before this news broke, I had literally just recorded a separate video about how the Seattle Police Department was essentially demanding that the local TV stations and newspaper hand over photographs and video of one particular moment of the protests when police vehicles were set on fire and guns were stolen out of them. They went through the court system to require that the journalists who took those photos, images, and video hand them over. And this has brought up a lot of concerns over the separation between police department, government, and journalists, and whether this would essentially turn journalists into an arm of the state. Washington's one of several states that has something called a shield law. It basically protects journalists from being forced to hand over certain kinds of information. And I'm not going to read you through everything on the screen right now. This is Washington's statute, and I'll put the link in the description if you want to read more about it. But essentially what it says is that for the exceptions to this law, there are basically four categories. And one is that the news or information must be highly material and relevant. Two, that the news or information is critical or necessary to the maintenance of a party's claim, defense, or proof of an issue material thereto. Three, the party seeking such news or information has exhausted all reasonable and available means to obtain it from alternative sources. And four, there is a compelling public interest in the disclosure. A court may consider whether or not the news or information was obtained from a confidential source in evaluating the public interest in disclosure. The judge has made a decision that he is going to review the material himself, or potentially hand it to a third party to review and see if there's any material that seems relevant for the police to look at as they investigate this case. This article in Reason brings up an interesting point that's also kind of depressing if you're someone who lives in the United States of America and thinks you have a reasonable amount of privacy. And you may not actually have that if a crime happens near you, because this person basically says, generally speaking, all of us have an obligation to turn over evidence relevant to criminal cases, including not yet filed ones, as well as civil lawsuits. That's so even if we are just bystanders. For instance, if the government or a civil litigant seeks recordings from our webcams that happen to record evidence relevant to a case. It's a limitation on our liberty and privacy, but one that Anglo-American law has long recognized. So basically likening this to, say, you're a witness to a car accident. They tell you, you got to stay here. You witness a murder. You got to stay here so we can get a statement from you and compel you to help with the investigation if you happen to have information that is necessary for it. I just think in this particular case, they're targeting journalists specifically, not just anyone who had recordings of that particular moment. And so as a journalist, it just, I don't know, it feels a little creepy to have a police department demand from a court system that journalists hand over information, and what kind of precedent does that set? The other thing you have to consider here is that if the government can force a journalist to hand over material, then they could potentially force a journalist to not hand over material. In other words, not hand it over to the public. So you're being forced to become an arm of the state in one way, giving your material to the government, but could then the government turn around and use that precedent to tell you what you can or cannot publish? Really, you got to look at this not just like a sliding scale, but a matter of principle. The second you open the door for something that seems obvious, now you've opened the door for murkier cases. And what happens when you put yourself in a place of power as the government, where you're taking material from a journalist in what might seem like an obvious case? Well, what happens down the road when a more nefarious government official now has the power to request the same kind of material? To me, this is very similar between the church and state division. Why you wouldn't want the church and the state to share powers, that you would want them to stay separate from each other, because in a lot of ways they hold each other in check. And journalists, as the fourth estate, even if they have failed miserably at this in some cases, are supposed to hold the government accountable. They're supposed to be the ones who are there to say, you know what, you guys are treading in murky waters and we're going to call you out because you're doing something illegal. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, we've seen, not just in recent years, but sometimes journalists can be working as an arm of the state without ever being forced to do that on their own. And to me, that's just as problematic, if not more problematic, because that's happening behind the scenes. Whereas this, at least, is happening in court. We can all pay attention and we know the ramifications. Ultimately, I have my own criticisms of mainstream media. If you're new to the channel, take a look at some of the videos I've done. It's not like I'm a former journalist who has Stockholm syndrome or anything. I'm very critical of them when they deserve it. But in this particular case, I'm going to stand with the journalists. I think this is very problematic, and I hope that at the end of the day, there is a clearly delineated line that remains between the government and journalism. So what happens to this case now that Chief Carmen Best is resigning from the Seattle Police Department? I don't know, and who knows if the next police chief is going to want to pursue this or if they will just drop it altogether. I do think, regardless, it's worth paying attention to this case. It's not getting a ton of attention. I think it deserves more because of the precedent it could set. I think that the free press in the United States of America is one of the central characteristics of this country, and if we lose that, we lose a lot. So if you're new to the channel, again, I'm Allison Morrow. Subscribe, hit that bell icon for notifications if you want updates when I upload a new video, and share this video with others you think might be interested. It definitely helps me in my analytics as a small creator to get the word out there. I will see you next time.